so much of what has shaped me as somebody who follows Jesus, or really what's shaped so much of what New Abbey has become, is I've always just had this inkling that there's more to the story, that there's something bigger there. And every time that I would ask questions when I was like a kid, like there wasn't room for that bigger idea of who God is. And then I remember going to college, and I was a biblical studies major. Talk about a good time. And we started it's a liberal arts education. There's all these things about Christian tradition and faith and theology that we started talking about. And I realized that so many of my friends who wanted to be pastors as well, that for them they just started to deconstruct and kind of leave the thing. That it felt like, oh, they've been lying to us the whole time. And for me, it was quite opposite. It's like, no. Maybe the story that we were given was just so small. Yeah, that doesn't work anymore. That doesn't fit all of God's goodness. That doesn't fit what the human experience is. They're just opening us up to a bigger story. There's always been more to this thing. We're just not allowed to talk about it. And I remember getting a job at like a large church, and I became a teaching pastor at like 23. God, that's a horrible idea. I can't believe they let me do that, right? Like talking to thousands of people 5 times a day on a Sunday, and you're just like, I have something to say. Who knows what I was saying, to be honest? It's crazy. None of that's a joke, by the way. But you get into the system of the church and you realize, like, oh, there's all these things I want to talk about. I think there's this bigger story of God that's out there, but you're not allowed to do that within the system. And it's almost like we were scared. We were scared that if we start talking about these things, that people are somehow going to stray, or it's going to seep into doubt. Instead of like just trusting that that's a normal part of the human experience, that when we doubt, when we question, when we figure it out, it actually makes us stronger and more healthy, and it makes us more pliable and malleable, and we grow and we evolve. And we know that in every other area of life. We know that like you gain muscles by straining them and stretching them and moving them and working them, and that's how you get healthier. You know that in your relationships. A lot of times actually when conflict happens, when you find resolution, you understand each other at deeper ways. But it's like we were scared to do that with Jesus. We were so scared to open this thing up in some way. I remember like learning about original sin when I was in college, and learning about original sin, that's not what the church has always believed. That's like a later development of our thought. And I'm like, why aren't we talking about that? It's not that I don't believe in sin. I just don't believe that there was belly buttonless people 6,000 years ago in a garden because they were talking to a magical snake and they picked fruit from a magical tree, that God has been so sad for humanity for thousands of years. That's a weird story if you really think about it. And that's not even the story that the church has believed most of the time. How do I know that? In the Old Testament, they'll never talk about that story again. That's crazy. You would think if that's the story, that there's an angry God because of belly buttonless people in magical gardens, we'd be talking about that story quite a bit. Jesus never talks about that story. If you think that's what Jesus came to do, is to rescue us because of the bad choices of Adam and Eve, why does Jesus never bring it up? It was just simple questions like that. I'm like, why are we not talking about this? Why are we not bringing this thing up? This story is actually so rich and so robust. And actually, I'm like, I believe in sin. I believe in sin, that there's a palpable disruption of shalom that is real in humanity. I know just from anecdotal evidence in my own life and the world around me, when I am hurt, I hurt myself and I hurt other people around me. That's sin. That's what the story is. And that there's a God out there who's not rescuing us because we're these horrible people. There's a God out there who's teaching us to care for ourselves, to love ourselves, to remind us of our goodness, to remind us of the image that we're made in, so that we don't hurt one another. Because when we don't hurt one another, there's magic in the air. When we use our energy, when we use our creativity to build one another up, when we use all of that to make movement in the world, what we are as human beings is incredible. That's what Jesus comes to do. There's this bigger story that was baked into the thing the entire time. We just weren't allowed to talk about it. And really that word that began to like resonate with me and bubble up inside of me when I was younger was like that the whole thing is sacred. What I was taught was sacred is just here. There's a little circle, and that's where sacredness happens. And we don't mess with the sacredness that's in the circle. This, like, here's like your quiet time and prayer. There's like this is the sacred space, right? You go to church, this is the sacred space. Even though a lot of people at church were assholes, it was still sacred because you were in the sacred space, right? And you're like, that doesn't make sense either, right? All these people are talking about good news, but they're some of the worst people I know. That doesn't add up, right? Not like morally worse, just like cruel and mean. You're like, am I missing something here? And I'm not saying to like judge you, whatever. I'm just saying you're just asking these bigger questions. And then as I started to like get into this Jesus story, as I started to take the Bible more seriously, as I started just looking at our larger Christian tradition, I realized, oh, what Jesus was always doing was saying, this isn't sacred. Sometimes we come to sacred spaces so that we can open our eyes up to the realization that the whole thing is sacred. That's what's interesting. I used to share this story in here all of the time that the rabbis used to say about Moses, that when Moses encountered the burning bush, it wasn't that the bush started burning. It's that Moses finally had eyes to see that the bush was always burning. The sacredness of God has always been around us. Jesus says, would you have eyes to see and ears to hear? Jesus wants to open us up to this bigger kingdom and this bigger reality. That's why Jesus uses that language all the time, because he's living in the world of Caesar. And he's like, this is the reality that you're given. This is what you're told life is. But what if the whole thing is way bigger than that? What if there's a kingdom out there that works for everybody? The whole thing is always getting bigger. We're always being brought into a larger sacredness. And so to talk about sacred today, we're going to talk about some things. We're going to do a little bit of recap because we are getting to Mark chapter 3. We are in the middle of April and we've made it through 2 chapters, people. Let's go! And the crowds went wild, 7 of them. I like that. We're going to talk about stringent. And if we can talk about what it means to be stringent, then we can talk about a giant conversation and missing the point. And after we can talk about the giant conversations and missing the point, then let's talk a little bit more about sacred. And if we can talk about the sacred, then maybe we can free ourselves that you have nothing to prove. And once you get to that place where you no longer have to prove anything, the freedom there is incredible. And if we talk about you having nothing to prove, then we can talk about how we can practice sacred. And then, how hugs improve free throws. You get it, where we're going on a Sunday morning. The Gospel of Mark is set up in a really interesting way. It starts with Jesus being baptized and the Father speaking over Jesus, this is my child, whom I love, with whom I'm well pleased. It's the beginning of the good news, that God is speaking over humanity those same words, that if it's true of Jesus, it's true of us. It's the reminder. It's not, come and save all of these wretched, depraved sinners. That's not the beginning of good news. The beginning of good news is reminding us of what's true and what's real about Jesus and about our own humanity. Out of that goodness, we see that Jesus goes around from town to town telling people the good news. But what makes Jesus great is Jesus doesn't just talk about it. Jesus shows people their goodness. So it says that everywhere that Jesus went, he healed people. How we say that at New Abbey is wherever Jesus went, he left people better off than when he found them. That's real good news. When good news begins to move from language, when it becomes embodied, when it moves towards your actions, it eventually becomes embodied in you. And when you leave rooms, when you leave conversations, when you leave jobs, wherever you go from, you leave it better than you found it because you just have good news baked into you. And then after Jesus goes around healing all of these people, then we get to this part of the gospel in Mark chapter 2, which we've been in for the last few weeks, where they start to challenge Jesus. And what's interesting in the Gospel of Mark is it's only for these first chapter and a half, 2 going into 3, where we have these stories of the Pharisees challenging Jesus. It's like Jesus wants to get us right away into untangling some things. Jesus understands, hey, you have this limited story that you've been giving. Let me untangle this story from you so that we can go actually do the work. So to recap that again, what's happening is Jesus comes in and talks about what he's about. So often in the world of deconstruction, we're so busy talking about everything that we're not about and everything that's not working for us that we're not actually for anything, and that's just not that interesting. And it's not that helpful for your life either. I'm so glad that we can all comment on social media and tell the world how bad it is. It's just not that interesting. It's just not. It's not changing the world. What changes the world is when you're for something. When you're just so deeply about that thing, you can talk about socioeconomic discrepancies, or you can go read to a 3rd grader every single week at your elementary school. Talk about it till you're blue in the face, the socioeconomic discrepancies on social media. Let me see how it changes the world. And I'm seriously, I'm all about that one. Some people push back on me on that. Great, happy to do it. But I just know that there's hundreds of people that went to their local elementary schools every single week and read to kids. The world would be so much different. So much different. And I think that's what's so interesting about Jesus in this, is Jesus starts with, what am I about? And then I go, do that thing. And then what Jesus does, when he's really clear on what the message is and what good news is, then Jesus is just aware of the fact that we all have built-in narratives that we need to get through. So in these early chapters of Mark, it's the religious systems, it's the government systems, and in a few weeks, it's family systems that Jesus challenges. Because Jesus says, hey, you were all given a narrative, and a lot of that narrative you didn't choose for yourself. And sometimes you got to untangle yourself from it so you can see clearly what you're about and clearly what you want to do and be for in this world. So we're in these stories in Mark where Jesus is untangling us from some of the systems that are around us. And Jesus is untangling us so that we can get to a larger story of what is sacred. And here's the secret of the Gospel of Mark. Here's what God thinks is sacred. Us. We're the sacred thing. I lived in a world where God was apparently this really insecure dude who drove like the biggest truck that ever you needed. Maybe someone else drives a big truck. That's not what I'm trying to say. Let's just back off that one for a second. Okay, great. Yeah. Anyways. But God somehow like constantly needed to be worshiped because God was insecure. And what I see when Jesus invites us to follow him is that Jesus never invites us to these big worship services. And I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm just saying if you start off being forced to worship this thing because you're scared of the thing, it's just never going to transform your life. But if you're invited into this really good story where God says, let me just say this as a parent, it's an unhealthy parent that is constantly needing the love and attention of their child. You're an adult. It's your job to give your love and attention to that child. That's your job. You get to do that. They don't know any better. And many of us have grown up unhealthy. I'll just speak for myself. I grew up unhealthy because I grew up in a family system after generation after generation after generation where adults needed the love of their children. And there's no satisfying that, by the way. That's not who God is. Who God is somebody who loves us. Jesus is constantly reminding us. Jesus came to us to remind us that we are sacred, that God has been okay with us. And that when we realize that we're sacred, when we know what the mission is about in life, this greater reality where the story of God is so big that we can live healthy, fulfilled lives. I have come that you may have life and life to the fullest. Now we're cooking. That's what Jesus is inviting us into. And so we start with this reality that we are sacred. To talk about that, follow on with me in Mark chapter 2. It says this. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick some heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Some guys had too much time on their hands. He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar," we all know those days, "the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." To continue on his point, another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. And some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. And Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." And then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" By the way, that wasn't a trick question. It wasn't like you needed a theological degree. Do you have a master's of divinity? Certainly do you speak Aramaic, Hebrew, and a little bit of Greek to be able to answer this. It was pretty straightforward, but they remained silent. And he looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. This is the story. The story is, I think for so many of us, let me speak for myself. I grew up in a world in which the word I kept thinking of this week was stringent. That's how I felt about God. Here's the definition for stringent: rigorously binding, strict, severe, or constraining. That's what church felt like. That's what faith felt like at times. Not always. There was so much beauty in it. There was so much goodness in it. There's a reason that I keep coming back and that I'm here today. But there was also parts of it that felt restrictive or limiting. And like we were asking the wrong questions. I remember being in college and we go through like church history and we would just talk about all the giant conversations and missing the point. Where for like 100 years, these monks in the Middle Ages debated how many angels could stand on the head of a needle pin. What a dumbass question. Truly. Or I grew up in a world where someone had to convince me the King James Version of the Bible was the only version of the Bible to read. That is so stupid. Or I knew other friends, they were in churches where they're like, we're going to introduce percussion into worship this week. Oh my gosh. Imagine the stuff that we talked about. I'm blown away that even today, I'll like see people who are like, we let women preach. Duh! We're not giving you a round of applause. The first person to see Jesus was a woman, right? They called the apostle to the apostles Mary because she got to the tomb first and she's like, guys, you're kind of slow to the race. Let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go, right? It's the things that we've debated that we're still in a world and we're like, is it okay to be queer? That's insane. These are giant conversations in missing the point. Jesus knew that. Are you really arguing with me about are my disciples going through a grain field? Jesus, throws a little bit of the Bible back at them. And he reminds us of they're sacred. And if they're hungry, they're going to eat. It's not that difficult. But we make it difficult. We make it way more difficult on one another for no reason. And then Jesus pushes the story even more. He wants to go show them what's more lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to bring life or to kill. It's not a trick question. And what Jesus is always inviting his followers into is everywhere I go, I leave people better than I found them. Maybe in the world that you grew up in, we talked about that as fruit. Do you have love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control just seeping out of your pores? Or do you have bitterness and resentment and anger and frustration and condemnation and guilt and shame leaking out of your pores? There's just different fruit that Jesus says. He doesn't judge you for that. Jesus just invites you into a journey of healing, saying, man, when you follow me, when you live this life, you begin to free yourselves from the stringent, restrictive world that you're given. You just realize, man, there's a life out there worth living. And if anybody is restricting you, just step away from them. You don't have to do that life. And by the way, I know sometimes I talk about it and it sounds like I'm just bagging on a bunch of conservatives, liberals. Let's talk about you for a second. The joy of being a pastor at New Abbey is, let's just be honest, I'm a straight white man. I'm part Latino, by the way. My melanin doesn't prove it. I'm sorry. But my father and my Mexican grandparents would beg to differ with you. But I walk around the world as a white man, and I know what it's like in the liberal world of, right? We look at the Bible stories, and we're like, Samaritans. The Jews didn't love Samaritans because they were what they would call like half-breeds back in the day. They were part Jewish, but they weren't as faithful as they wanted to, and there's a Babylonian exile, and you can go Google it later if you want to. But they weren't loved. So there's always somebody in every culture where like, ooh, they're bad. I know what it's like to be a straight white man. That's like a bad word in our world sometimes. And my point is, we just always pick something to blame. It's not that interesting. It's not that helpful. A friend of mine runs one of the largest Latino organizations in the United States in which they help thousands of young Latinos a year get education. It's a $1 billion organization. And after an event last year, someone emailed them and said, you're not doing enough for the black community. Really? Really? Another friend of mine does some of the best work for the LGBTQ community, for the queer community, for the gay community, lesbian community, trans community. And someone once told him, you're just not doing enough for the trans community. You only have one thing for this, but 6 things over here for the gay and lesbian community. Really? We eat our own sometimes. And what I'm always passionate about this, what I love about Jesus always went out there and did it. I'm always fascinated by the people who are commenting on social media and not doing anything. Go out there and try to do it. Go out there and build towards that. But if we're just so busy always attacking a thing for not being enough, we're just playing the same game but on another side of the coin. It's not helpful. And I say that because I've been the pastor of New Abbey. I've been told we don't do enough for the gay community, the Latino community, the Asian community, the black community. I've had other straight white men, so we don't do enough for straight white men. I've got it all, people. And I'm like, really? It's just not interesting for me. And I feel freed from that now. It's just giant conversations and missing the point. And I'm not going to put my energy there. And I hope you don't put your energy there in your life either. Go for the things that you're for. Go for the things that you can build. Go for the things that you find sacred in your life and add some goodness there. That's what Jesus is moving us into in this story. Jesus just keeps reminding us of what he's for, and what he's for is humanity. What he's for is for our thriving. What he's for is for our healing and for our goodness. And all of the other distractions are simply that. And Jesus seeks to untangle us from all of those distractions. I think one of the gifts that happens when we start to untangle ourselves from those distractions is we no longer have something to prove. For years at New Abbey, I've had so many conversations with so many of you, including myself, where I needed to prove something to someone else. For years, I needed to prove to all of the other pastors that we weren't heretics. I would get so many emails and be taken to so many coffees, and you're teaching these people, this was my favorite one I ever got. You're teaching them about grace and love, but are you teaching them truth? And it sounded just like that, like an a-hole. And I thought that I had to prove something until I was finally free of, I don't have to prove anything to you. Come and meet these sacred people. Come and see the fruit in their life. Come and see the love that's exploding out of them. Come and see what freedom looks like. Come and see when somebody gets to be fully honest with their Father. Come and see when lives get to be fully alive and nothing is hidden. Come into a room when an addict can stand here and say, I relapsed, but I'm 7 days sober. Thank you for being here for me. Come and taste of that goodness. I have nothing to prove. For my queer brothers and sisters in the room, you have nothing to prove. You don't have to convince anybody that the Bible says this, and then that one Greek word in Romans 1, it's a mystery. You don't have to do any of it. If you want to, have fun. It's really interesting stuff, and boy, were they wrong. But you don't have to do anything. There's a guy, by the way, named Richard B. Hayes, one of the foremost New Testament scholars on planet Earth, who for a long time, every conservative denomination in the world used his work on sexuality, and in the last month, he has shifted and evolved and wrote a new book. And the conservative community has no idea what to do with it. The foremost scholar on the New Testament in the world wrote a book called Widening God's Mercies. And it's full acceptance of the LGBTQ community. Thank God for you just clap that on. So if you want to do that work, do it because you enjoy it. Do it because you want to grow and evolve. But don't do it because you need to prove anything to anybody. You don't. Jesus wants to heal you and give you life because you are sacred, period. There is nothing else to the story. If stringent is defined by that we're constricted, sacred is defined as this: connected with God. That's literally the definition. That's what we want when I mean sacred. Jesus challenges all the sacred systems of the day. The story before this was about fasting. This is a story about being in the Sabbath. They were what people considered, these are sacred things that you do. But these sacred things that they were doing were actually restricting and confining people. And what Jesus is opening up sacred to is, no, I just actually want people to be connected with God. And if on the Sabbath day they're hungry and they're in a grain field, man, make some sourdough, my friends. If you have a shriveled hand or you need healing, there's nothing that should prevent you from going and finding that healing. There's no one that should get in your way of telling you that you're not allowed to be fully human, is the story. And Jesus goes and heals. He makes the point by healing, by doing the thing, by living into the good news, by embodying it. That's what Jesus is showing us, because Jesus wants us to be connected with God. And I think one of the things that we get back to when we get full circle here is the stories are really not about how you fast. The stories are really not about what you do on the Sabbath. But once you find some freedom from that, once you really get an idea of what good news is, we will get back to this place of, but there is an important place in our life for practices. Because practices remind us of what's always true. Practices remind us when we forget things. My favorite practice is coming here. This is my spiritual practice. I define a spiritual practice by anything that we do when we bring our intention and attention towards God. How do I know that? Have you ever been on a date with somebody or out with a friend and you missed the whole night because your intention and attention was somewhere else? That's normal. But when you brought your intention and attention to them and you just felt the magic between you, this person that you loved, even after 20 years, that they still have so much to offer you and you to offer them, that's the goodness in the world. You know what that's like. Have you ever just been with a dog and you finally realize, this thing loves me so stinking much? Have you ever been with a cat? Never happened. So, I love you cat people. I still don't love cats, but I'm with you cat people. Some of you are like, I'm leaving this church. That was it. That is the line that was crossed, and I'm no longer okay with it. And I understand that for you, and I would say, God bless you, and Godspeed. I'm joking. When we move our intention and attention towards God, anything can become a sacred practice. You can run, or you can go running. And that can become an intention and attention towards God, where you feel the energy that's just different. That can go dance, garden, read a book, do quiet time, pray. I don't care what the thing is, but I think what Jesus is getting us to is that eventually we need to rebuild some of these practices in our lives, like Sabbath, like creating rest, like creating space. And once we've untangled them, once we've gotten rid of all of the other narrative that's not helpful, then it creates freedom for us just to remind ourselves of connection with God. And then when we do it, because we're no longer worshiping a God who's just got some type of insecurities or ego issues, we're doing it because this God loves us and is reminding us of our goodness. And when we practice some of these things, eventually we begin to have eyes to see that there's sacredness in everything. That's the gift. I remember a few weeks ago you shared, and it really got to me, about quiet time with your kids. And before you were so faithful at it, and then almost like a resentment that built up for your kids because you no longer get to have that time. And it was really moving for me to hear, because there's just seasons of life where we have to change our practices. And there's probably like weird, stringent, restrictive things sometimes even that we put on ourselves or other people put on us. But it's just a season when we open ourselves up and we begin to see sacredness everywhere. Now your spiritual practice is actually hanging out with your kids. That the image of God is just dancing around you. That the image of God is just free and playing. Man, New Abbey, my just wish for this community is that you would be free. That we would all be free together. That we would know that we don't have to restrict ourselves. We don't have to limit ourselves to what God has for us. My hope for this community, New Abbey, is you have nothing to prove. Nothing to prove in this world. You are made in the image of a creator. You are good. You are a child of God. You are pleasing to God. We will remind ourselves of that truth week in and week out until it leaks from our cells. New Abbey, we are sacred. And now hugs for free throws. Scientists have figured out that if you give someone a hug or a physical touch after they missed their first free throw in basketball. For you sports ball fans, here's how it works. In a penalty shot, generally in basketball, you get 2 shots. Sometimes you get 3, but most of the time you get 2. And sometimes if you miss your first shot, they have found that the statistics go dramatically up if somebody just comes and gives you a physical touch or a hug. You have elevated anxiety. That moment that you feel connected with another human being, your ability for success goes way up. There's just sacredness in that for me. It was a reminder that we all just deeply desire, I think, to be connected with God. That we deeply desire to be connected with one another. That we need one another and that we need God. In life, there's more serious things than missing free throws. And in those moments, we need one another. We need one another in times when we feel elevated levels of anxiety, stress, or difficulty, that we're not alone. That we are all sacred. And the part of the work that we do, New Abbey, is when I forget my sacredness, you remind me of it. And when you forget your sacredness, maybe I will get the chance to remind you. And that, my friends, is the work that we get to do together. If you find those same 3 or 4 people around you, what practice can you make sacred this week? Enjoy.